What is immersion? Well, the dictionary defines it as the state of being completely submerged in something. This can apply to many different contexts, but the one I want to talk about today is narrative immersion. This is when the audience is transported to a place where dreams become reality and the real world is forgotten. Of course, there are many ways to achieve narrative immersion, whether that be through a movie, a book, or a video game. There's one form of immersion, however, that stands above the rest: dark rides. These types of rides are designed to physically immerse riders in another world. But how do they do it? How do theme parks take guests out of the resort and into different cities, countries, and even planets? Today, I will answer these questions by explaining the 4 key methods that theme parks use to create great dark rides. I'll also be presenting the 4 rides that I believe use these methods the best. Welcome to Reed Rides, a place to talk about all things theme parks. My name is Reed, and as always, please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss my next project. Without any further ado, let's jump into the video. Let's start with what I like to call the boom or bust method: animatronics. These are machines designed to mimic the lifelike actions of their character. The great thing about them is their incredible range. Animatronics can be the focus of an entire ride, or they can simply exist to add kinetic energy to a land. Primarily, though, they serve as a tangible part of the experience. What I mean by that is that animatronics add a physical dimension to the dark ride that hooks the guests and immerses them. They make riders think, wow, that pirate is actually standing right in front of me. They're also a great way to communicate story. Animatronics can hold riders' attention and further the story via built-in speakers. Of course, animatronics have their downsides. They are very complicated systems that require extensive maintenance, which is why most amusement parks don't splurge on them. Even the parks that do go for it sometimes can't get them to work. Look at something like the Yeti animatronic on Expedition Everest at Animal Kingdom. Experts say it cost around $12 million to build, and it doesn't even move anymore. Broken animatronics can undermine the narrative immersion that dark rides strive to achieve. Hence why I call it the boom or bust method. Nevertheless, when animatronics are working, they are among the best ways to immerse riders. Now, the ride that I think best uses animatronics is Monsters Unchained at Epic Universe. There has been a recent trend in dark rides with parks moving away from screens and using physical sets instead. Monsters Unchained is the perfect example of that. Opening in 2025, Monsters Unchained takes riders on a journey through the catacombs where they will encounter classic Universal monsters like Dracula and the Wolfman. This is where the animatronics come in. By my count, there are around 17 complex animatronics on this ride, which is insane for a modern-day dark ride. What's even crazier is that most of them perform sophisticated movements, like Dracula here, who breaks out and throws riders out of his way. Now, I want you to imagine that instead of an animatronic, Universal went for a screen. Wouldn't look nearly as good, right? Well, this is because of that tangible factor that I mentioned before. Riders will see something real and therefore interact with it more. It's also worth noting that the animatronics on Monsters Unchained have had lots of maintenance problems. I've actually never ridden it with all of them working, which speaks to just how risky they are. Still, I hope parks like Disney and Universal keep using them because the value that they add is so important for the immersive experience. Now, this next method is a bit controversial, but I see it as a necessary progression of dark rides: screens. During the 2010s, screen rides became a cheap, easy way to add a new dark ride. Universal spearheaded the screen renaissance with attractions like Fast and Furious Supercharged and Jimmy Fallon. However, to put it lightly, these rides were not very well received. In reality, the quality of the screen renaissance triggered immense blowback from guests. It didn't help that most screen rides also caused motion sickness. These factors pushed parks to explore other methods and reduce, but not remove, screens in their new rides. I firmly believe, however, that screens can be very helpful when immersing guests using a dark ride. For example, they can fill out space that physical sets just couldn't. Look at something like Navi River Journey. The screens there blend effortlessly with the physical sets. Screens are also the premier way to tell a story on dark rides. They allow for more action, more dialogue, and a more effective narrative. The cherry on top is the cost. Screens are incredibly cheap and don't need as much maintenance as animatronics. Now, my pick for the ride that best uses screens should come as no surprise: Flight of Passage at Animal Kingdom. This ride is a full-on screen dark ride. There are no physical sets, and yet it is the most popular ride in the park. The environment that the screens present is stunning. Everything from the floating mountains to the bioluminescence to the final shot look amazing. The sound quality here is also great. The music is emotional and pairs really well with the visuals. One of the best parts of Flight of Passage is, surprisingly, the ride vehicles. The motorbike seating makes it feel like guests are actually riding on a Banshee. In fact, riders can feel the Banshee breathing, which I think is a very nice touch. Unique ride vehicles are what can elevate a screen ride from mediocre to elite, and Flight of Passage is a great example of that. There's a reason Disney chose this to be the headliner for Pandora. It's a fantastic ride and one of the best screen rides out there. Flight of Passage is proof that screens can make good dark rides, they just need to be implemented right. Moving on to our next method, shock value moments. These are moments on a dark ride that surprise riders and fill them with awe at what they just experienced. Oftentimes, these moments will be huge in scale. They serve to go beyond what guests think possible of a dark ride. Some may think that shock value moments are simply the climax of a ride, but I have to disagree. One ride alone can have several shock value moments, varying in degree. There could even be one in the queue that keeps guests entertained as they wait. Really, these moments are about breaking expectations. Guests will always have a preconceived idea of what a ride may do, and these moments try to shift that idea. Think about Hagrid's at Islands of Adventure. At first, guests will think this is a normal roller coaster. But Hagrid shifts that notion by having dark ride scenes, a backwards section, and even a drop track. However, it's important to note that shock value moments cannot break the idea of what a ride is, or else it could be disappointing. Despite all those surprising moments on Hagrid's, it is still a roller coaster, which is what guests signed up for when they got in line. Now, the dark ride that I think best uses this method is Rise of the Resistance at Disney's Hollywood Studios. Rise of the Resistance is the perfect example of using shock value moments to meet expectations. This ride had a $1 billion budget, and when it opened, many were saying it was the best ride of all time. However, I'll admit that I was skeptical, and it wasn't until I rode it a few months later that I understood. Rise of the Resistance takes the core idea of a dark ride and makes an experience out of it. Disney did this through, you guessed it, shock value moments. There are so many of these moments on Rise of the Resistance, but one stands above the rest. In the queue, guests will walk onto a ship and go through a quick simulator section. But after that is where it gets really interesting. They will exit the same way that they came in, but instead of seeing that familiar path, they'll be walking onto a Star Destroyer. This new room is massive with tons of stormtroopers and a huge screen that shows an expansive view of space. This moment works so well because it surprises guests by having them exit the same way they came in. It creates an impossible illusion that succeeds in immersing every single person that walks through the line. Rise of the Resistance doesn't change the dark ride formula, it enhances it, and that's exactly what shock value moments should be used for. The final method is possibly the most important of the four: mood. Mood is defined as the emotional atmosphere that the viewer experiences. Mood is what draws guests to a ride, but also what keeps them engaged. Therefore, mood must be shown at the entrance, in the line, and on the ride. Of course, it's hard for a ride to show mood in all three. A ride's line could set the atmosphere really well, but if the ride doesn't do the same, then there's a problem. This is the case with rides like Fast and Furious Supercharged. Clearly, the stakes are high when dealing with mood, but they're not impossible to beat. To create mood, theme parks should look at past rides and learn from their successes and failures. In fact, my pick for the ride that best utilizes mood is one of those past rides, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror at Hollywood Studios. This ride is the perfect blueprint for how to set the mood. Tower of Terror correctly executes the three phases that I mentioned before. The entrance is one of the best out there. The hotel looms over the rest of the park and has an eerie vibe to it that attracts anyone looking for a thrill. In the line, that eerie mood is amplified with cracks in the courtyard and that beautifully scary hotel lobby. The pre-show and the boiler room keep the mood going until riders finally step foot on the elevator. This setup from the entrance and line is perfect in nearly every way. It doesn't force information upon the guests. Instead, it lends itself to their imagination. Of course, the ride experience has to actually be good, and, well, it's amazing. The spooky dark ride sequences combined with the randomized drops create an experience that guests will want to ride over and over. By hitting all three mood phases, the entrance, the line, and the ride, Tower of Terror cements itself as one of the best dark rides out there. And there you have it. The 4 strategies that theme parks use to create great dark rides: animatronics, screens, shock value moments, and mood. When theme parks use all these methods, they create generational experiences. For my parents, that ride is the Haunted Mansion. For me, that ride is the Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man. For the next generation, who knows? It could be the Encanto Omnimover, the Lost Continent replacement, or something at Disney's Villains Land. Nevertheless, the future is bright for dark rides. Thank you all for listening to my thoughts on what makes a great dark ride. Make sure to leave a comment sharing your thoughts. I want to know what your favorite method is, or if I skipped over one that you find important. This is Reed from Reed Rides signing off. Let's ride.